Okay, well, lovely to be here with you all and to actually be out of spectator seat and briefly into sharing for a while. Lovely to have some of my former students just checked in on the chat there from. So I, until very recently, was a lecturer at University of South Wales, and I'm a counsellor and therapist, and also have a background, which I'll share a little bit through this presentation, in using theatre and life story work to work with people from a whole host of different, often marginalised backgrounds. But actually, before I share what I'm going to be talking about in this session, I would just like to invite you, if you feel able to, and if it doesn't feel right for you, please just float off wherever you'd like to. But if you do feel able to, just invite you to just pause for a moment and reflect on your experience of the COVID pandemic. Maybe just tap into that, just briefly and just gently, but just to acknowledge for a moment that we have all lived through an extraordinary experience over the last couple of years. And of course, we will each have experienced that differently and uniquely, but that perhaps there is something of value in when we do come together in these settings of just allowing a moment to acknowledge that, and to think about perhaps how it's changed you. What's different about you and your relationship to the world, your work, others from 2.5 years ago? What are you bringing now to your work that perhaps you didn't before? And also an invitation, as the title of this session is, that maybe to notice if there's anything you'd like to let go of, anything that you're still carrying from the last 2.5 years that it might be nice to just lessen the load of, let go of a little bit. And I would also just like to acknowledge the many losses that we as a human race, as the world, have experienced, and also the many injustices that the COVID pandemic has exposed, exacerbated, highlighted, and perhaps with that, the opportunity for change that comes, the opportunity to maybe do things slightly differently moving forward. So just kind of thought maybe it might be helpful to just start with that, just really brief check-in about, yeah, we've all experienced this and we've all survived it. So let's be, yeah, certainly for me, I'm thankful for that. Okay, so we can kind of shift gears slightly now, and I'm just going to share with you here's where my heart goes. Please let me be able to share with you on my PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. There we go. Yeah, great. So the project, the pilot project that I'm going to just briefly talk about in this session was called Let Go. And it was a collaboration across disciplines. So between myself, Simon Edwards, and Sophie Redlin. So I shared with you my background. Simon has a military background. So he was a soldier, a coach, a leadership consultant. And Sophie is a GP, a mental health trainer, and a researcher. And the way in which we came together, we each received a Churchill Fellowship, which is a scheme I don't know if people are aware of, but it's a scheme which enables people from the UK, but I believe there's also an Australian sister organisation, to travel to anywhere in the world to research best practice in a specific area of work, with the aim of making the world a better place, essentially, as utopian and idealistic as that sounds. But it's a fantastic opportunity for people to go and research things that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily get funded through maybe more kind of mainstream funding. And it's very much about going away, researching an idea, coming back and doing something with it, putting it into practice. So the Let Go pilot, which was a retreat project for NHS and social care staff who identified themselves as experiencing moral injury, exhaustion or burnout as a result of working through the pandemic. That came about through our Churchill Travel Fellowships. So just to very briefly summarize those, my fellowship was I went to America and also briefly to Bosnia to explore, to look at how creative approaches, predominantly theatre, but also songwriting, dance, movement, were being sort of harnessed to help people recover from post-traumatic stress and from experiences of trauma. And I was looking predominantly at experiences of military veterans and families. Sophie, who is a GP by profession, she went to spend time learning about and experiencing talking circles with American Indian and Native Alaskan communities. So she was immersed in the idea of working in a non-hierarchical circle so that essentially the community does the healing in a non-hierarchical way. And then Simon, so the third fellowship, Simon went to the Boulder Crest Foundation, which is the leading body for the understanding and the development of post-traumatic growth. So the three of us who didn't know each other at that point, we went off, we had these experiences, and we came back, and through then a few sort of serendipitous moments, we were put in contact with each other, and what we realized was that we had all arrived at a very similar or related realization, and this was about moral injury and the idea that often after traumatic experiences, the distress that people are living with is deeper than a cognitive and emotional, even deep, and that it is a spiritual form of suffering. So moral injury, if you're not familiar with that term, has been used predominantly in our understanding of the experiences of military veterans. So Brett Litz described it as a deep psychological wound caused by perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So when we see, witness, or perpetrate something that kind of feels to our core essentially wrong. So if you just kind of keep that idea in your mind for a moment as we move into thinking about the pandemic. And then Jonathan Shea, who was actually the psychiatrist who first coined the term moral injury in relation to therapeutic work. He describes it as the undoing of character caused by a betrayal of what's right by those in authority. And a lot of his work was with Vietnam veterans, and he through his research and practice over 30 years, he came to the belief that a lot of this suffering and distress of Vietnam veterans was caused by lack of opportunity to grieve and to, he used the term, communalize suffering. So to actually together acknowledge the weight, the depth of what people had experienced, and he argues, and there's lots of research to back this up, that a generation of predominantly men, but also family members, then was left in a place of enormous psychological suffering due to that lack of space to grieve, process, reflect. So the three of us, Sophie, Simon, and myself, came together with the idea of developing a pilot to address or to test out a way of working with moral injury in health workers. So over the last decade, our understanding of moral injury has broadened a little bit out of the military context and is now being spoken about in areas like for journalists who are working in traumatic areas, or social frontline, first responders. And then the COVID pandemic has opened up this new, I suppose, way of us conceptualizing the deep suffering that health and social care workers are experiencing. So this quote there, I'm not sure if you can see that, is from Dean et al. In America, and they are a group of health professionals who wrote an article in 2020 after the loss of three co-workers, three fellow doctors, to suicide. And in this article, the quote here says that we know that when we stop doing, we're going to start feeling. And they have, Wendy Dean in particular has gone on to create, it's called Moral Injury of Healthcare, which is a fantastic body that is doing a lot of campaigning, activism, really challenging the narrative around how we understand burnout, exhaustion, overwhelm, and start to see this in terms of moral injury. It changes what we understand, and it changes what we need to do. So again in 2020, at the start of the pandemic, Williamson et al. Identified these sort of risk factors for health and social care workers developing moral injury. Not being able to provide care that feels good enough or meets personal standards. So in doing so, violating the moral code, the sense of, this is what I signed up for, this is what I dedicated my professional life to. And if in those extraordinary situations that we were witnessing, and some of us were no doubt working through, it was impossible at times to provide standards that were consistent with normal times. Crucially then, a sense of betrayal, being let down by those in authority, lack of PPE, staff shortages, pay freeze. Now, of course, we could add to that now in 2022, couldn't we? Everything that's come out since in the UK, with the government, with the Partygate, all of that stuff that we're living with daily and in social media and in the media. So if we think about how that might feed into moral injury, having to make morally complex decisions in challenging circumstances, to process and to grieve, and also the comorbidity of exhaustion, burnout, anxiety, depression, what we know about in the UK, and also, no doubt in other countries, that this, before the pandemic, this was a workforce that was already experiencing really high levels of stress, overwhelm, and mental illness. So in terms of what the evidence base is, or what's starting to be discovered in terms of how to help with moral injury, all of this so far relates to military populations. There hasn't as yet been much research around actually testing anything out for health and social care workers. But the crucial thing, what the crucial findings of that what's helping veterans so far and families is multidisciplinary approach. So this idea that it has to be multifaceted, and that the community is crucial to people's recovery. So Brock and Latini, two incredible women in America who developed the Soul Repair Center, and the language around moral injury, it's notice perhaps what your response is to this, but it uses, and we in our pilot Let Go deliberately used words like soul, spiritual, and we were very careful with our participants that we emphasized this for us did not have any religious connotation, but that actually it was a way for us of conveying the depth of impact and the depth of recovery. So findings from the Soul Repair Centre indicate that a sense of community, having your story witnessed, and self-forgiveness were key factors in helping people recover from moral injury or moral repair, which is the term Brock and Latini use. Adaptive disclosure is a group therapy program which is showing promising early results, which is where people gradually share in a group setting their difficult experiences. And part of that, which is a little bit kind of like Gestalt therapy and the empty chair exercise, individuals have a conversation with a benevolent other, which could be a friend, a family member, it could be a fictional character, it might be God for some people, but it's a very overt way of asking for forgiveness. There's also, I won't read all these out, but there's some early suggestions of self-compassion. And surprisingly, for those of us who are familiar with that, being a helpful moderator in the link between poor mental health and moral injury. So with our the retreat program that we piloted, it was a residential retreat in a rural setting, and our kind of overarching aim, was to challenge how emotional distress is understood within the health and social care setting. And I'm just going to skip through some of these because it's surprising how fast the time goes. So over the 3 days, day one, the theme was who I am and making sense of my experience. So it's quite hard to read this. Day two, the theme was letting go of the past, self-forgiveness, acceptance, self-compassion. And day three, post-traumatic growth and a new future. And I've put there the essentials. I thought if I had to convey in one sentence or one phrase what worked about this pilot, and I've put the circle. We spent the entire 3 days in a circle. The fire, we had a fire in the room that we were working in, and we kept that lit while we were awake. So it was we did this in, when the weather was colder, and there was a big roaring fire which went the whole time. Good food. The participants, commented on how, having worked through 2 years of a pandemic, how much it actually meant to have somebody cook some lovely homemade food and put that down in front of them during our breaks. Deep listening, humor was essential, and for anyone who's worked in an NHS setting, that kind of dark humor as a way of coping, that emerged a lot. And also music was really key to this work. So just going to share with you now, I guess, a few of our, just a little bit about what happened, really. So we asked participants to bring with them an object that connected in some way with their experience of working in the pandemic, of strength, of what had enabled them to keep going. And those objects, when we set up our first talking circle, were placed in the middle, and they stayed there for the 3 days. I guess in a way they became an anchor. And then following from that, we asked each person, and a really important point to make is that in the circle, there is no hierarchy, there is no leader. So we, as the three, people running this retreat, were also participants, which was really interesting and challenging in some ways when you're, as I am, used to that kind of clear divide. Okay, I'm the therapist here, or I'm the lecturer here. Actually, I was fully immersed in this circle, and it was a wonderful privilege to be so. So another key aspect was we asked each person and ourselves to tell the story of an ancestor. And this was I think, vital to us establishing this bedrock for the 3 days. So people within our group, we had people from, there was one person who was from India, another from the Philippines, another from Ireland. So we had this heritage, this shared sense of people's stories, where they'd come from, and bringing an ancestor into the space meant that they were then part of the witnessing process. They were with us for the 3 days. And it was a surprisingly, for me, very emotional experience, to both for me and to witness other people's ancestors being with us. I know that might sound extraordinary or ridiculous to some people, you know, I don't mean we were kind of summoning spirits, but we really were, you know, kind of acknowledging, yeah, what would it be like if we tapped into these people being with us? So for that first day, we talked and talked and talked. We had a timetable, a loose timetable, but the methodology of the talking circles is a circle takes as long as it needs to. So the next day when we reflected as a group, we looked back and we think we talked for 12 hours. So, you know, we did break, we had cups of tea, we went outside, you know, obviously, but it was a long process, and it was a very, yeah, it felt like a privilege. People were sharing stories of what they'd witnessed, experienced, done during the pandemic, and that was held by the group. That evening then we had a music session. So a friend, colleague of ours who's a music therapist came in and just did a kind of free expression of music, which again, I think contributed to that sense of release and healing. This is a picture of the actual fire that we had in our room. And this was what one of our participants, an emergency department nurse, said about the experience of a whole, but particularly about that first day. She said, I feel like a big thorn that was embedded in my heart has been pulled out. And that bearing witness. So as we moved into day 2, we invited people to bring the difficult stuff. We invited people to bring anger, to bring betrayal, to bring disappointment. And there were lots of things voiced that were difficult, that were political. You know, we gave ourselves full permission to say, this is political. How can it not be? That several people voiced how they felt about things like the clap for carers, for example, about the idea of being put into this sort of role of angel as a nurse in the NHS, and how unhelpful that was for some people, and actually, you know, that contributed for some people to the sense of guilt and complexity and shame that many people were naming. And a really key part of the second day was we spent lots of time talking about self-compassion and forgiveness, and really exploring what they are, what they mean to people. And then one of the exercises that we did, which Sophie had been given permission from a Native American elder to share this circle with us as a group. And we stood as a group in a circle, and each person, each of us, myself included, said spoke into the middle of the circle one thing that I would like to forgive someone for, and then turned to the person next to you in the circle and said one thing I would like to be forgiven for. And then the person next to you said simply, I forgive you. And this, you know, as I'm saying it now, it sounds like such a simple exercise, but it was profoundly powerful. And I felt it myself, this release, this permission that we will all have got things wrong in our work, in our life, over, you know, during the pandemic. Other people will have. One thing that one person shared was she was a nurse and she'd been transferred to, you know, a totally different department in the pandemic, and things were chaotic. and someone had shouted at her, and she carried that for 2 years, and the pain of that. And through this exercise, through the process, she shared that she was able to, she said, I forgive that person. I know we were all in unusual, very unusual times.
Just 4 minutes to go, Alison.
Thank you, Michael. So I just wanted to share with you now, one of the exercises that we did on the final day was we asked each person to write a letter to themselves, a compassionate letter, which is quite a technique of self-compassion work. And one of the nurses, Susan, not her real name, has given me permission to just share a little bit of her letter, just very briefly. And she wrote to herself, "Dear Susan, you've come so far since arriving here 4 days ago. You've stopped crying so much when talking about how you feel and sharing the last 2 years. You have learned that Susan was always there. She just lost herself in the roles and responsibilities of this time. You have learned that self-compassion and forgiveness hold the key to your future. You have learned that it's okay to feel vulnerable. You are not weird or messed up. You were morally and spiritually injured, and now you start the process of recovery." So the final point here, on our last day together, we shared with participants the concept of post-traumatic growth, which is essentially that through trauma, through difficulty, we may discover, and this is not a given, but we may, that we are stronger and more resilient than we thought. Because of what we've overcome, we may experience a deeper appreciation and gratitude for life. And we may discover a spiritual connection or a change within ourselves or a deeper meaning for life as a result of reflecting and reflecting on our experiences in order to transform them from a place of pain and hurt into a place of depth, strength, and growth. So while this is not for a moment to minimize suffering or to say, look on the bright side, everything will be fine. It's the opposite of that. It's acknowledging that recovery is slow and deep, but that given the opportunity and space, people can, just in the space of 3 days, make a journey towards recovery, which will be ongoing. And just lots of references there if you're interested in hearing more about this work. And just to say that our group are now connected through WhatsApp and we have regular Zoom check-ins, and that in itself has been, just that WhatsApp group is now a space where if somebody is struggling, they reach out and immediately there's this shared understanding, this depth of care for each other, which I think may, who knows, prove to be lifelong. So thank you for listening to that. This is, we're hopeful that we have a funding interview this month, that this is a project that will develop and we'll be able to work with lots more health and social care workers in this way. So thank you, Mike. I was just going to say, I don't know if there's time for any questions or feedback. Sorry that I took the whole time there.
Let's give it 1 minute, perhaps, for any questions, very quick questions and answers.
Yeah, I think the slides are going to be shared, Jamie, so that's great.
Yeah. If there are no questions, I was loving the ideas of the tools that you used to help people. The forgiveness exercise, stunning, absolutely. Yeah. The essentials that you had at the retreat, the circle, the good food, all creating a very safe space for people to, disclose and, unload. And even the WhatsApp group, and keeping in touch with people, excellent tools, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mike.
So thanks, Alison, for your input. It's really interesting work. Thanks indeed.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.